Seattle in the rainy season always carried its own kind of sadness, a damp melancholy that seeped into every street corner, every breath of those who lived there. That morning, Ruby Tyson woke before sunrise. She listened to the soft patter of rain on the thin tin roof, the wind whistling through the old window frame. The tiny apartment barely fit 2 people, yet to Ruby, it was her whole world, the world she had fought to keep with everything she had. She brewed coffee in silence. The old machine protested before slowly dripping dark drops into her cup. Ruby didn't drink right away. She sat by the window, gazing out at the empty street, where the first yellow streaks of a bus light sliced through the rain and reflected on the glass. Seattle never slept, and neither did she. David was still asleep in the bedroom, breathing evenly, his forehead slightly furrowed. He was a man of dreams, but never dreamed that it included her. Ruby knew that, yet she still told herself, it'll be different one day. She loved him with every bit of her youth, with the naive belief that love would bloom if you sacrificed enough. But life is never played by fair rules. She had 3 shifts today: morning at the diner, afternoon at the grocery store, and night cleaning offices downtown. Every paycheck barely covered rent and the bills. David always said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," but never did. He was studying economics at the University of Washington, smart, ambitious, always talking about a bright future. Ruby believed in him like she believed in the sun, even if it never shone into their apartment. Marco, the diner's cook, was the first to see Ruby that morning. He shook his head as she walked in, drenched, hair plastered to her face, hands trembling from the cold. "You didn't have to take the early shift, Ruby. It's okay," she smiled, tucking her hair back. "I'm used to it." Marco sighed. He knew he couldn't stop her. There was something in Ruby's eyes, a quiet, stubborn light that made people both ache for her and feel helpless. During her break, she carefully jotted down numbers in a small notebook: expenses, tuition, gas, groceries. Each figure was neat and precise, like how she kept her life orderly, but suffocatingly small. She closed the notebook and glanced at a tiny photo of David tucked in her wallet. His bright smile was the only light in her grey days. Ruby touched the picture gently and whispered, "We'll be okay, won't we?" That night, David picked her up in his dying old car. The rain hadn't stopped, the windows fogged, the air thick with dampness and fatigue. "Did you turn in your paper?" Ruby asked, trying to sound cheerful. "Not yet. My laptop crashed. I need a new one. I'll figure something out." David said nothing, just sighed, which Ruby knew meant yes. He rarely said thank you, but Ruby never needed him to. All she needed was for him to be there, even in silence. That night, they ate instant noodles together. David read while Ruby mended his shirt. The warm light fell across his face, focused, beautiful. Ruby looked at him and smiled. She didn't feel tired, only a strange peace. He looked up and caught her gaze. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Because you're the most beautiful thing I have." David chuckled and turned back to his book. Ruby kept looking, not knowing that moment marked the beginning of her own disappearance. A month later, David got good news. A company in San Francisco had invited him for an interview. Ruby cried with joy. She ran around their apartment, hugging him, repeating, "I told you, you'd make it." David kissed her forehead, a soft, distant kiss. "If I get it, we'll move there. Everything will change." Ruby believed him, the way a child believes in fairy tales. She sold her grandmother's silver ring, her only keepsake, to buy him a new suit. The day David left Seattle, Ruby stood at the bus station, the cold wind stinging her face. He turned back and waved, smiling brightly, while she shivered with emotion. Marco stood beside her, murmuring, "Ruby, don't let your dreams be only about him." She just smiled. "His dream is mine too." And Ruby believed that everything is worth it when 2 people love each other. San Francisco greeted them with golden sunlight and the smell of sea salt. Ruby was dazzled by the colorful houses on the hills, the winding streets, and the sound of waves in the distance. Their small rented apartment in Pacific Heights had a window overlooking the bay. Ruby loved it instantly. She thought, "This is a new beginning." At first, David was busy settling into work. Ruby found a part-time job at a bakery to stay occupied and help him save money. She tucked every dollar into labeled envelopes: rent, groceries, gas. David never said much, just accepted them. But he'd always say whenever someone asked, "I handle all the bills." Ruby heard it and smiled. She thought, men need to feel proud. Women need to stand behind them quietly. One night, they celebrated when David officially got promoted to project manager. Ruby made dinner herself, with candles and cheap wine. "I told you I'd make it," David said, raising his glass. "And I," Ruby whispered, "never stopped believing in you." He gave a strained smile, his eyes distant. Ruby sensed something shifting for the first time, a thin thread stretching between them, almost invisible, but pulling tighter every day. Time passed. David grew busier. He laughed less, talked less, and touched her less. His phone calls ran past midnight, and dinners turned silent. Ruby didn't ask. She was afraid to make him tired. It wasn't until Marco texted her from Seattle that she realized she no longer had anyone else. In this big city, she was utterly alone, surrounded by space. Ruby found a flyer for a fashion design class at the nearby community college one afternoon. She hesitated, then showed it to David. "I was thinking, maybe I could take a night class." He didn't look up. "You don't need to waste time on that. You don't even have to work anymore. I just want to do something for myself." "Ruby," he cut in, "don't be selfish. I'm under a lot of pressure. You should be supporting me, not distracting me." The words struck her silent. That night, she stepped onto the balcony, looking at the distant city lights. San Francisco was beautiful but cold. She felt so small, like even her voice wasn't allowed to exist anymore. She quietly cleared the table, washed the dishes, and turned off the lights. Only the ticking clock remained in the darkness, slow and painfully steady. That night, Ruby stopped dreaming about the future. She only dreamed of sleeping peacefully. The rain in Seattle once soaked her clothes, but the rain in San Francisco soaked her soul. And Ruby Tyson, the woman who once lived for someone else's dreams, began quietly fading away. Ruby's life in San Francisco moved like a sad song without a single crescendo. She still woke up early, made coffee, cleaned the house, waited for David to leave for work, and then stayed home preparing dinner. Everything was on time, in place, in order, except for one thing that no longer fit their love. David was no longer the man she had known in Seattle. He dressed sharply and spoke in the language of power. His eyes had grown cold, and his hand clutched his phone tighter than hers. The more successful he became, the farther he drifted away. And Ruby, she was still the same Ruby, only now her gentle face seemed to fade a little more each day under the bright lights of the upper-class city. At dinner, they sat across from each other, the candlelight casting two silent shadows on the wall. "Is it good?" Ruby asked softly, afraid to disturb the air. "Yeah," David answered curtly, eyes still on his phone, one word heavier than a sigh. Ruby searched for excuses. Maybe he was tired. Work was too much. Every time he frowned, she felt guilty. She was afraid to ask more, afraid to annoy him, scared to become a burden. But the quieter she became, the further apart they grew. Ruby lay awake on the couch some nights, watching the city lights flicker on the wall, aching for Seattle where the rain soaked her clothes but her heart stayed warm. Here, the sun blazed golden, yet people were colder than ice. One morning, David forgot their 5th wedding anniversary. Ruby didn't get angry. She placed a small lavender stem in a glass jar, next to a handwritten note. "Thank you for letting me love you for 5 years." When David came home, he glanced at the card, nodded slightly, and said, "I've got an urgent meeting. I'll be dining out with clients tonight." Ruby smiled and tucked the card into a drawer, not because she was sad, but because she no longer wanted to make anyone remember what they'd already forgotten. That evening, she went to the old diner in Sunset where she used to work. Marco was stunned to see her walk in. "Good God, Ruby Tyson, where have you been all this time?" Ruby smiled, weary. In a place where smiles need practice, Marco looked at her, concern deep in his eyes. "You've lost weight, yeah, but at least I'm still breathing." They talked for a while, rain tapping softly against the glass, the air warm with the smell of coffee. Ruby spoke of her life not complaining, not bitter, just calmly, like she was telling the story of a movie she'd accidentally chosen with the wrong ending. When she left, Marco called out, "Ruby, love isn't worth losing yourself over." She didn't turn around. She just raised her hand to say goodbye. Across the street, the headlights lit her face tired but tender. The next day, while cleaning, Ruby found a business card from a textile and fashion school tucked away in a drawer. Her heart raced. An old dream stirred. She wanted to try again to live for herself, even just a little. That evening, as David finished dinner, Ruby spoke carefully. "I was thinking, maybe I'll sign up for a night class in fashion design. It's only for a few months." David didn't look up from his laptop. "Why? What for?" "I just want to try. You know I've always loved." "Ruby," he cut in, weary, "don't waste your time. You don't need to do anything. I'm working for our future. You need to support me. That's enough." Ruby froze. "But I need something for myself too." David shut his laptop and looked at her, eyes cold. "You're being selfish." The word hit harder than a slap. Ruby sat still, heart pounding, lips trembling, but no words came out. She stood, washed the dishes, her hands shaking, scalded by the hot water. That night, she stepped onto the balcony, staring at the faint lights of the Golden Gate Bridge. Her chest felt hollow. Somewhere in this dazzling city, she was being stripped away piece by piece. A month later, David invited her to a company gala. Ruby felt a childlike excitement. It had been so long since he'd asked her out. She spent hours picking a dress, finally settling on a simple cream. She tied her hair neatly and dabbed on soft lipstick. She wanted to look natural, not trying too hard. But when she stepped out, David barely looked up before frowning. "Don't you have anything classier?" Ruby hesitated. "I thought it was just a casual dinner." "It's with major clients, Ruby. I don't want you to feel out of place." The words seemed harmless, but they cut deeper than any insult. Ruby quietly changed. Her face paled. The gala was held at a luxury hotel, bathed in golden light, glasses sparkling. Ruby followed David, smiling awkwardly, his hand never reaching for hers. Everyone greeted him warmly, laughing, shaking hands. He gave her a few polite nods and fleeting glances when he introduced her. A blonder woman asked, "So, Ruby, what line of work are you in?" "Oh, I'm not working right now. I stay home." "Oh," the woman lifted her brows, smirking. "Lucky you. Not everyone gets to stay home all day." Laughter rippled around them, soft, but sharp enough to sting. David said nothing. He was already scanning the room for someone more important. Ruby slipped out to the balcony, the wind tousling her hair. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself a woman standing alone, lost in her husband's world. On the drive home, David scolded her. "You embarrassed me. Did you see how everyone else dressed? I told you to change, but you still went simple." Ruby clenched her hands. "I just wanted to be myself." "Yourself?" he scoffed. "Sometimes who you are doesn't fit here." The sentence echoed in her head like a verdict. Days passed. David grew busier. His phone now had a new password. He went out more and came home later. Ruby didn't ask. Not because she didn't want to, but because she feared the answer. One morning, she woke to find him already gone. On the nightstand, a note, "Don't wait for me for dinner." Ruby picked it up, set it down, and stared out the window. The sunlight revealed the dark circles under her eyes. She tried to remember the last time they held each other and realized she couldn't. One afternoon at the market, Ruby overheard two women chatting behind her. "He's handsome. The girl he was with last night was gorgeous." Ruby turned. On one of their phones was a photo of David, her husband, beside a blonde woman at another party. She froze. Her heart didn't break, it simply stopped. Back home, Ruby sat on the floor, phone in hand, afraid to open it. She didn't cry. Her tears had long since run dry. That night, the ticking clock echoed through their elegant apartment, counting down the last beats of a dying love. Ruby sat at the table, staring at the ring on her finger, and for the first time in years, she asked herself, "Who am I living for?" A simple question, yet it shattered her entire world. Ruby Tyson, the woman who once gave everything for love, had begun to see the truth. When love changes its flavor, it's no longer love. It becomes a habit, a quiet endurance dressed up as sacrifice. And from that moment on, something inside her quietly died. Early May in San Francisco, warm enough for the rich to wear light coats, while still showing their elegance. At the Call family mansion in Pacific Heights, golden light spilled through tall glass windows. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter echoed, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who knew how to wear power like perfume. The Call's annual brunch was a place to show off houses, children, and success. Ruby was there only so David wouldn't lose face. That morning, she stood before the mirror for a long time. Her pale blue dress was the simplest she owned, modest, graceful, unbranded. Her hair was tied low, and she had small leather shoes and a touch of soft pink lipstick. Ruby never liked attention. She only wanted to look decent enough not to be noticed. David glanced at her, frowning. "Don't you have something else? That color looks washed out." "I thought it looked proper," she said quietly. "This isn't a tea party. These are people who matter, Ruby. I don't want you to look out of place." "I'll be fine." He said nothing more and walked away. Ruby took a deep breath, forcing back tears. She had grown used to feeling wrong even for something as small as the color of her dress. The brunch was held in the Call's backyard, the rose garden trimmed to perfection, a white tablecloth stretched across a long table, crystal glasses gleaming. Patricia, her mother-in-law, appeared in a deep red dress, her perfume heavy, her smile sharper than ever. "Ruby, you're here," Patricia said, her tone gentle but laced with judgment. "Yes, Mother," Ruby greeted softly. "Your dress is quite special," the woman remarked, her gaze traveling from Ruby's head to her shoes, pausing. "Custom made?" Ruby smiled. "Yes. I sewed it myself." Patricia raised a brow. "Oh, handmade. How charming." It sounded like a compliment, but her eyes told another story. The people around them chuckled. David stood beside Ruby, silent. Through lunch, Ruby sat still, her posture calm, her heart burning. The conversation floated around stocks, real estate, yachts, and luxury vacations. No one asked her anything, and when they did, the question came with a blade. "So, Ruby, how do you pass the time at home?" Nora, David's sister, tilted her head. "Oh," I read, "and I help David a little." "How lovely. I always tell my friends my brother is so lucky. Not everyone gets a wife who stays home all day." Laughter rippled across the table. Patricia joined in, lifting her glass. Women like Ruby, who still keep the old traditions alive, so rare these days. Ruby pressed her lips together, swallowing the ache. She knew that David would think she'd embarrassed him if she reacted. But her heart began to tighten, every polite jab cutting her open, thin and bloodless. Then Nora pulled out her phone, laughing. Everyone turned to look. On her screen was a photo of Ruby standing alone in the garden, earlier in her pale blue dress. The light had hit her just so, making her look frail, almost colorless. The caption read, "When the help gets a seat at the table." Laughter erupted. Ruby froze. David muttered, "That's enough, Nora." But his voice held no anger, just a token protest for form's sake. Ruby stood to leave, but Patricia's voice stopped her. "Sit down, dear. Don't make a scene. We're only having fun." Having fun. The words struck like a slap. She sat again, staring into her untouched glass. Around her, the voices, the laughter, the clinking of crystal blended into a grotesque symphony, and Ruby realized she was the only offbeat note in the score. She finally understood. There was never a place for her in this world. The party was ending by the time the sun dipped over the bay. Ruby stepped out onto the terrace, the wind sharp, cold, and salty. David came up behind her. "You should learn to endure a bit more. They didn't mean any harm." Ruby turned to him, eyes blazing. "No harm? You stood there while they laughed at me, and you say they didn't mean harm." David frowned. "Don't make a scene, Ruby. You're embarrassing me." That word, embarrassing, struck her harder than any insult. All these years, she had kept his dreams alive, guarded every dollar, every bit of peace they had, only to hear that she was his shame. "Have you ever thought about how I feel?" she asked. "Ruby, I'm tired. Don't make me deal with your little dramas." She let out a laugh, low, cracked, aching. "So to you, I'm just a little drama." David said nothing. He walked away. Ruby watched his back grow smaller, swallowed by the amber light of sunset, and in that instant, she knew what loneliness truly was. They drove home in silence. The streetlight swept across Ruby's face, revealing exhaustion carved deep into her features. When they returned, she changed clothes, washed her hands in cold water, and watched them tremble. Her tears came quietly, without warning. That night, David read the paper in bed. Ruby sat by the window. "Do you remember why we came to San Francisco?" she asked softly. "So I could build a career," he replied. "And me? You came with me." Simple words, but they cut like glass. Ruby stepped onto the balcony. The city below glowed like a galaxy, headlights streaking like falling stars. Down there, thousands of people were living, loving, being loved, and she was merely existing in a life that should have been hers, but had somehow been taken away. She missed Seattle, the tiny apartment full of rain, the nights of instant noodles and shared dreams. She missed seeing herself reflected in the eyes of the man she loved. Now, those eyes held only irritation. David's phone lit up. A message appeared. He turned it off quickly. Ruby didn't ask, because when you have to stay silent to keep someone, it means they're already gone. The next morning, Patricia stopped by. She rested a manicured hand on Ruby's shoulder and said gently, "My dear, successful men often change. Know your place. The more humble you are, the more they'll love you." Ruby smiled faintly. "If I have to bow to be loved, what's that love worth, Mother?" Patricia froze, then chuckled softly. "Oh, sweet girl, you'll learn." When the door closed behind her mother-in-law, Ruby sank to the floor. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, landing on their wedding photo, two bright, hopeful faces once convinced that love was enough. Ruby stared into her own eyes in that picture, pure, trusting, and she whispered, "I'm sorry, Ruby. I let them take you away." That evening, David came home late. She didn't ask where he'd been. He set down his briefcase and said flatly, "Next weekend is my father's birthday party. Don't do anything to make it awkward for me." She nodded quietly. David didn't know that sentence began a night that would change everything. The night when Ruby Tyson would never again be the same woman. That afternoon, wind from the San Francisco Bay blew hard, carrying a salty chill. Ruby stood in the kitchen, a half-finished birthday cake before her. She had spent the whole week preparing for tonight, a party celebrating Maxwell Call, David's father. Ruby wanted to make it meaningful. Instead of ordering from an expensive bakery like every year, she decided to bake it herself, her grandmother's old recipe, rich with vanilla and butter, filling the small apartment with a scent that reminded her of simpler days. David walked in, frowning as he saw her. "What are you doing?" "A birthday cake for your father. I told you just to order one from the store. I wanted to make it myself, to show that I care." David sighed, shaking his head. "Ruby, you always make things complicated. Just don't embarrass me tonight, okay?" The familiar words hit her again, cold as a verdict. Ruby said nothing. She just kept stirring, her hands trembling slightly but her eyes steady. Maybe they didn't need her sincerity, but she did. She needed to know there was still something inside her that was real. Ruby arrived early at the Call mansion that evening to help set up. Everything was flawless, white roses down the table, gleaming crystal, fine wine arranged in perfect lines. She was a small, misplaced flicker in that world of polish and perfection. Patricia looked at her and smiled thinly. "You made the cake yourself? How? Charming. Let's hope it's edible." Ruby smiled politely. "Yes, I think Father will like it." Patricia chuckled. "Oh, I doubt it. He has a taste for more refined things." Guests began to arrive. Laughter filled the air. Champagne flowed. Music swelled softly. Ruby tried to blend in, though her palms were slick with sweat. She placed the cake on the table, heart pounding as eyes turned toward it. Patricia took the first bite. She raised her eyebrows and smiled. "Oh, it's actually good. Which bakery did you order from?" Ruby's voice wavered. I baked it myself. Patricia laughed, turning to the others. Homemade? How quaint. She must be trying to help us save money. The table erupted in laughter. David sat silent. He didn't defend her, didn't even look at her. Ruby's lips trembled. She looked around, searching for one sympathetic face, but everyone averted their eyes. Her hands tightened in her lap. The laughter echoed inside her head, slicing through her dignity like glass. When Maxwell finally raised his glass, he said warmly, "Thank you, dear, for putting this together. But next time, don't trouble yourself. We can afford the bakery." Laughter again. Ruby lowered her head and smiled faintly. In that moment, she felt less than human, just an ornament for their amusement, a prop to make others feel grander. She excused herself and stepped outside. The night air hit her face sharp, cold, and clean. Inside, the lights glowed. Music floated, a world of privilege continuing without her. Ruby stood on the edge of it all, an outsider in her own life. When the party ended, Ruby stayed to clean. The guests were gone, leaving wine stains, and laughter clung to the air. David approached quietly. "You really don't know how to act, do you? You made things awkward for me all night." Ruby turned to him, stunned. "What are you talking about? I barely said a word. That's the problem. You sit there looking all miserable, and everyone feels uncomfortable. I hate that." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "You hate that I look miserable? Maybe you should ask why I am." David said nothing. He sighed. "I'm tired, Ruby. Stop making drama. Sleep in the living room tonight if you can't calm down." The words were soft, but they killed whatever hope was left. Ruby didn't cry. She whispered, "Okay." She walked out, her legs numb. The living room was dark, cold, lit only by a faint hallway glow. Ruby sank into the couch, resting her head on her arm. The ticking clock filled the silence, each sound another stab to the heart. Outside, the rain began to fall. Drops hit the window like quiet sobs. Ruby smiled weakly and rasped, "At least someone knows I'm sad." She lay back, staring at the ceiling as tears slid into her hair. Something inside her finally died in that darkness, the part that believed love could fix anything. But something else began to stir in the ashes of that loss, a small, defiant seed that wanted to live, breathe, and be herself. The next morning, Ruby woke to pale light and an aching neck. She heard laughter from the kitchen, David and Patricia, cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "I told her not to make a fuss," David said, "but Ruby's always too sensitive." Patricia's voice was syrupy sweet. "She's not made for this world, dear. One day, she'll leave on her own." Ruby stood frozen in the hallway. In that instant, she understood they had never seen her as part of their world. And maybe it was time to stop forcing herself into it. She walked to the bathroom, turned on the water, and looked in the mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale face, swollen eyes, exhaustion etched deep. She stared for a long time, then whispered, "Who are you, Ruby?" No answer. Only the steady sound of running water and in it, a decision forming. That afternoon, she got into her car and drove with no destination. The streets of San Francisco stretched endlessly ahead. At a red light, she saw a small sign on the corner, "Apex Legal Services." Ruby blinked. Then she turned on her blinker and pulled in. Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee. A woman of Asian descent looked up from her desk and smiled. "How can I help you today?" Ruby drew a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I'd like to see a lawyer. May I ask what for?" Ruby looked down, eyes red but voice steady. "I want a divorce." The woman nodded gently and gestured for her to sit. Ruby sank into the chair, her heart hollow, but her fear gone. Outside, rain began again, light and quiet like a soft kind of freedom. That night, when she came home, David was watching TV. He didn't ask where she'd been. Ruby sat down, silent. A commercial played on the screen. "Sometimes, to find yourself, you must lose everything." Ruby looked up, and a small smile touched her lips. For the first time in years, she didn't feel pain. She just felt clear. The morning after that fateful night, sunlight sliced through the curtains, falling in narrow strips across the wooden floor. Ruby lay on the sofa, her neck stiff, eyes swollen, The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and the sound of David's steady footsteps filled the apartment so familiar, it almost felt like nothing had changed. But everything had. David stepped out, dressed sharply, with a navy tie in place and a coffee cup in hand. "Aren't you getting up to make breakfast?" Ruby lifted her head, voice hoarse. "You can make it yourself." He raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Someone's bold this morning." "So, did you learn your lesson yet?" The words, light and casual, cut straight through her. Ruby looked at him for a long moment, then turned away. "I did," she said quietly. "I learned that if I stay here, I'll disappear completely." David didn't understand. He just shrugged, sipped his coffee, and left. When the door closed, Ruby sat up. The sunlight hit her face harsh, but clear. The living room that had been her punishment last night was now where she finally began to exist again. She walked around the apartment, touching each thing: the couch, the wedding photo, the pair of mugs they once used. Everything remained in place, but it all felt lifeless. Ruby washed her face and looked into the mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale, tired, but with a glint of something sharp and awake in her eyes. A cold, lucid kind of clarity. She put on a coat, got in the car, and drove without direction. The streets of San Francisco looked different that morning. Every building, every sign, every passerby seemed distant, like part of a world that no longer belonged to her. At a red light, Ruby's gaze caught a small sign on the corner: Apex Legal Services. The same place where she had spoken 5 words changed everything yesterday. "I want a divorce." She parked and went inside. The Asian woman at the front desk smiled. "You're back?" Ruby nodded. "I need to see the lawyer." A few minutes later, a tall woman in her 40s appeared, sharp-featured, composed, kind. "Hi, Ruby. I'm Laura. Are you ready to talk?" Ruby took a deep breath and nodded. In the quiet office, Laura's pen moving across paper blended with her calm, steady voice. "Do you have children?" "No." "Has there been physical abuse?" Ruby shook her head. "No. He makes me feel invisible." Laura looked up, eyes soft but piercing. "Ruby, that's emotional abuse." The words struck like lightning. Ruby gave a weak laugh, shaking her head. "He never hit me. He never yelled." Laura spoke gently but firmly. "He doesn't have to hit you to hurt you, Ruby. When someone makes you believe your worth no longer exists, when you're afraid to speak, to breathe, to be wrong, that is abuse." Ruby sat in silence. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of being understood for the first time. For years, she had thought herself weak, believing that if she tried harder, he would change. Now she understood. He never needed to change. She needed to save herself. Laura closed the file softly. "If you decide to do this, I'll help you immediately. But you need to be sure. Divorce isn't just paperwork, it's a declaration that you choose yourself." Ruby looked out the window, where sunlight spilled across the street. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered. "But I know if I don't do this, I won't be me anymore." Laura smiled. "Then you're already strong." That afternoon, Ruby drove home with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, as if she'd finally stepped through a door she'd been too afraid to open. David was on the balcony, talking on the phone, his voice brisk and confident. "Don't worry. Everything's under control at work." Ruby walked past him without a word, her heart no longer trembling. She opened the closet, pulled out a small suitcase, and began folding clothes. The sound of the zipper sliding shut was quiet, yet it rang like the start of something irreversible. David came in, frowning. "Where are you going?" She didn't look up. "Out. For a few days." "This is about last night?" "Ruby, you're overreacting." She set the suitcase down, meeting his eyes. "You told me to sleep in the living room until I apologized. I'm just doing what you said. I'm leaving because I have nothing to apologize for." He stared, speechless. "You think you can survive without me?" Ruby smiled softly. "Without you, at least I can survive as myself." He laughed, half mocking, half angry. "You've got no job, no money, no one. What will you do, Ruby? Start over. With what? With self-respect." She pulled the suitcase behind her, the wheels clicking steadily across the hardwood floor like the heartbeat of someone finally awake after a long, silent sleep. As she reached the door, David shouted after her. "You'll regret this." Ruby stopped, turned slightly. "I've been regretting for years, David." "Not anymore." She stepped outside. The afternoon sun bathed her shoulders. The wind picked up, swirling dry leaves around her feet. Ruby took a deep breath. No fear, no pretending, only silence, the gentle, sacred silence of freedom. She drove aimlessly until she spotted a small cafe on a street corner. The window fogged with steam. The handwritten sign read, "Be kind to yourself." Ruby parked, went in. The smell of fresh coffee wrapped around her. She sat alone, watching people pass by, feeling a quiet peace she hadn't known in years. She opened her phone and typed the first line in her notes. Day 1 of freedom. And somewhere deep inside, Ruby heard a voice she hadn't heard in so long, her own, whispering, "Welcome back, Ruby Tyson." San Francisco mornings always carried a particular kind of light, thin, golden, and cool. Ruby opened her eyes at 6. She was no longer in the old house. Her small rented room sat on the second floor of a roadside motel, its window facing the bay, the sound of waves echoing faintly in the distance. No more David's footsteps. No more coffee brewing for someone else. No more schedules but her own. Ruby sat up, pulled on a light sweater, and made instant coffee. The sharp, bitter scent mixed with the damp chill of dawn. She stood by the window, watching the pale sky grow brighter. The first thing she felt wasn't fear, it was peace. Today, Ruby would sign her divorce papers. She'd thought all night about the years behind her, about every time she told herself, just a little longer, until she realized that a little longer had stretched across half a lifetime. Her old car rumbled along the wet road toward downtown. Rain from the night before still glistened on the asphalt, reflecting the faint morning light. Ruby didn't turn on the radio, she just listened to the engine's hum, steady as her heartbeat. When she arrived at the law office, Laura Chen was already waiting. "I knew you'd come," Laura said with a kind smile. Ruby nodded and sat down. Laura slid the papers across the desk. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "Sign here and you'll officially be free." Ruby took the pen. Her hand trembled slightly, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what that small act meant. She signed Ruby Tyson Call, then stopped to look at the name. 3 words, one hers, one his, one they had once shared, now about to separate forever. Slowly, she crossed out Call, leaving only Ruby Tyson. Laura nodded gently. "You just chose yourself again, Ruby." A single tear fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. Ruby laughed softly and wiped it away. "Funny," she said. "I thought I'd cry more." "That's because you've already cried enough," Laura replied. When Ruby stepped outside, sunlight hit her face. It felt like shedding a skin she'd worn for too long. She breathed deeply, the air smelled faintly of salt and possibility. Across the street, a small cafe played a mellow tune. A lyric floated through the air. "Freedom tastes like morning light." Ruby sat on a nearby bench, watching people pass, each carrying their own story and invisible weight. The world hadn't stopped when she walked away, and strangely, that realization comforted her. Her phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. She hesitated, then answered. His voice was tense, urgent. "Ruby," Laura told me. "You signed?" "Yes." "Are you out of your mind? Do you know what a divorce will do to my reputation?" Ruby smiled faintly. "You still care more about appearances than people, David. Don't act like you're the victim. You chose to follow me." "That's right," she said quietly. "And now I choose to leave you." Silence stretched on the line. Then he said, "You'll never make it on your own." Ruby looked out toward the sea, her tone calm, almost serene. "You're right. I couldn't survive if I'd stayed." She hung up. For the first time, not a single tear fell, only a smile. That afternoon, Ruby returned to the motel. A drizzle misted the window pane. She sat on the bed, opened her old laptop, and searched for jobs. No degree or recent experience, only her hands and persistence. She sent applications to coffee shops, bookstores, and a local sewing workshop. That evening, she went out to buy a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. On the way back, she passed a thrift store. A small Singer sewing machine sat in the window, its metal surface scratched but gleaming faintly. She stopped and stared for a long time. Price, $40. Ruby opened her wallet, $86 left in total. She smiled and walked inside. "I'd like to buy that sewing machine," she said. The shop owner, an older woman, looked at her kindly. "It's an old one, dear. You'll have to adjust it by hand." Ruby nodded. "That's okay. I've done harder things." Back at the motel, Ruby placed the machine on the table, plugged it in, and pressed the pedal gently. The needle moved slow, uneven, but alive. She took an old dress from her suitcase, cut, stitched, adjusted. The first stitches wobbled, but soon her hands found their rhythm. The sound of the needle pierced the fabric, soft, steady, like a heartbeat finding its way back. By midnight, Ruby finished her first dress. It wasn't perfect, a seam slightly crooked, but it was honest and beautiful in its own way. She slipped it on and stood before the mirror. For the first time in years, she saw someone she recognized. Ruby Tyson is simple, sincere, and smiling. She picked up her phone and took a photo. Under the warm light, her eyes glowed with quiet fire. She posted it with the caption, "Start with your two hands when you don't know where to begin." No likes, no comments. But Ruby didn't need them, because the only person she wanted to see finally did. She sat on the bed, looking out the window. The rain had stopped. Tiny stars peeked through the night sky. Ruby whispered, like a promise to herself, "Tomorrow, I'll live. Not for anyone to see, but so I can see myself." Inside that small room, the sewing machine rested quietly on the table, a new heart, still beating. The morning of freedom wasn't loud or radiant. It was just an ordinary morning, but it finally belonged to her. Autumn in Portland carried its scent, damp leaves, roasted coffee, and sunlight resting softly on cobblestone streets. Ruby arrived by an overnight bus, clutching an old suitcase and a small sewing machine in a cardboard box. She didn't know a soul here, but something about the Portland air made her feel like she could finally breathe again. Her first rented room was an attic in an old house, barely enough space for a bed, a small table, and a single window overlooking a row of maple trees turning gold. Each morning, she opened that window to let the wind rush in, to let the fallen leaves rest on the sill, and to let the light touch her face. It became her quiet ritual for a new beginning. Ruby found a job at a small independent bookstore in the Alberta district. The place smelled of old paper and freshly ground coffee, with a chalkboard sign at the door reading, "Porter's Books and Coffee." The owner was an older woman with silver hair and bright eyes, Maxine Porter. The interview lasted only a few minutes. "Have you worked anywhere before?" Maxine asked. "At a diner, and a few other places. Do you like books?" Ruby smiled faintly. "I used to forget what that felt like. Now I want to remember." Maxine nodded. "All right, come in early tomorrow. Doors open at 8. Ruby wiped tables, organized shelves, and made coffee on her first day. Maxine watched her and said, "You're too careful. Here, people do things good enough." Ruby's voice was soft but sure. "I used to live a life where everything was just good enough. Now I want to do better." Maxine smiled, a small, knowing smile. That afternoon, when the store quieted down, Ruby sat behind the counter sketching dress designs she hadn't drawn in years. Her fingers trembled at first, but the lines began to flow soft, feminine, and true. Maxine peeked over and asked, "You studied design?" Ruby nodded. "I once wanted to, but I wasn't brave enough." "Are you brave enough now?" Ruby looked up, her eyes glimmering. "I'm learning to be." At night, she sat by her sewing machine under a warm lamp, the sound of the needle steady and patient. Outside, the wind blew and the city slept while she, the woman who had once fallen apart, was quietly stitching herself back together. Weeks passed, and Ruby found rhythm in her days. Mornings at the bookstore, afternoons mending dresses for neighbors. One evening, Maxine brought her a bag of clothes. An old customer left these vintage dresses. "Fix what you can and keep what you like." Ruby unfolded them, faded floral fabrics, soft as memories. She repaired each one with care. A few days later, a young woman walked into the shop, saw Ruby wearing one of those dresses, and exclaimed, "Oh my God, that dress is gorgeous. Where did you get it? Ruby hesitated. I made it myself. Do you sell them? Please. I'd buy one in a heartbeat. Ruby laughed. I haven't thought about selling them. Well, you should. I'd be your first customer. The words hit Ruby like a ray of sunlight piercing through old dust. That night, she posted a picture of the dress online with the caption, "Handmade in Portland by Ruby Tyson." She expected nothing, just wanted to mark a small moment. 2 days later, the post had 13 likes and one message, "Do you take custom orders?" Ruby stared at the screen, heart pounding, fingers frozen, before she finally typed back, "Yes." Her first client was a woman who asked for a simple dress that feels peaceful. Ruby stayed up all night sewing, cutting, stitching, undoing, redoing until it felt right. When she shipped it, she wrapped it in brown paper and added a handwritten label, "Made with care." 3 days later, the woman messaged her, "Thank you. I wore your dress on my walk today. Everyone complimented me. I felt beautiful again for the first time in years." Ruby read the message, and tears streamed down her face. She never imagined something made by her hands could touch someone else the same way she once longed to feel her lost self. When Maxine found out, she hugged Ruby tightly. "See, I told you. Every woman has something taken from her. The question is, will she take it back?" Ruby smiled through tears. "I am. Stitch by stitch." That winter, Ruby officially opened a small online shop called Second Sunrise. The name came to her one morning when she saw the sky burn red over the horizon. The first time in years, she'd looked at the future without fear. Orders began to grow from ordinary women, mothers, divorcees, all asking for something handmade that made them feel whole again. Each message, each thank you note, reminded Ruby that her pain had turned into something quietly powerful. One evening, Maxine said, "You know what I see in you, Ruby? A beautiful kind of strength that doesn't make noise." Ruby smiled. "I'm just learning not to be afraid anymore." "Don't just learn it," Maxine said softly. "Teach it." Ruby didn't answer. She looked out the window. The street outside shimmered under the rain as if the whole city had been washed clean. That night, she sewed a dress of soft ivory fabric. When it was finished, she folded it carefully and placed it aside. She didn't plan to sell it. On its tag, she wrote, "For the woman I used to be." Before turning off the lamp, Ruby whispered, almost like a prayer, "Thank you for not giving up, Ruby." And in that tiny attic in Portland, surrounded by fabric, thread, and the quiet scent of new beginnings, a woman who had once been broken was truly coming alive, from the ashes of her own past. Spring in Portland shimmered with light. Ruby unlocked the front door of her small shop, Second Sunrise, tucked neatly on a quiet street. The walls were painted a soft yellow, the wooden doorframe still worn at the corners, the hand-painted sign swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the scent of new fabric mingled with lavender and the hum of a sewing machine, blending with the soft rhythm of jazz. The shop was small, but it pulsed with life. Ruby had hired 2 women, Anna, a single mother, and Josie, a recent high school graduate. Both said Ruby had given them a reason to believe in themselves again. Ruby only smiled. She knew the truth. It was they who helped her believe again. One afternoon, a young local journalist came to interview her, a girl with brown hair, bright eyes, and a voice full of energy. "We heard your shop helps women who've gone through hard times. Why do you do it?" Ruby paused, thoughtful, then said, "Because I used to be one of them. I know what it's like to be dismissed and invisible, to have to stitch your life back together with your bare hands. I want them to know they can feel beautiful again, strong in their own way." The article went online the next day with the headline, "Phoenix Rising, the woman who sewed her life back together with thread and grace." When the story spread, Ruby was in the shop arranging dresses, and her phone began to buzz. Non-stop messages, orders, and congratulations were flooding in. Josie squealed, "Miss Ruby, you're famous now." Ruby laughed softly. "No, sweetheart. I'm just finally beginning." That evening, back in her apartment, she turned on the light and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection glowed beneath the warm lamp, calm, mature, wearing the smile of someone who had weathered every storm and stood firm. Ruby Tyson, the woman once exiled to the living room, could now walk into any room she wanted and needed no one's permission. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, the sky broke open with rain. David Call sat in his corner office on the 25th floor, staring over the city. Raindrops slid down the glass like slow tears, blurring the shimmer of traffic below. On his desk lay a thick stack of reports and the morning's financial newspaper, the headlines screaming, "Call Industries faces internal collapse." 3 key executives had quit, taking their biggest client with them. A significant project had been cancelled. Shareholders were demanding answers. The phone rang endlessly, each call bringing worse news than the last. David tugged off his tie, pacing. He had once believed he was untouchable, that intelligence and ambition alone could bend the world to his will. But now, everything was slipping away, cold, fast, merciless, just like he had treated others. A soft knock at the door. Patricia stepped in. "Are you all right, son?" David didn't turn. "All right? The company's losing half its value, Mother. Does that sound all right?" She sighed, resting a hand on his shoulder. "People don't just hate failure, David. They hate arrogance." He clenched his fists. "I only did what was necessary, just like how you treated Ruby," she said quietly. He froze. "Ruby has nothing to do with this." Patricia's smile was sad. "Everything has to do with how you treat people. They're standing with her now not because she's famous, but because she reminds them of something you lost. Compassion." David frowned. "What are you talking about?" Patricia laid a magazine on his desk. On the cover was Ruby, serene, radiant, eyes bright beneath the headline, "Phoenix Rising, the Rebirth of Ruby Tyson." He picked it up, staring at her face. The Ruby in that photo was nothing like the woman he remembered, no longer timid and weary. She glowed with confidence, with freedom. His chest tightened. A strange ache spread through him, regret, disbelief, something that tasted bitter and unfamiliar. He remembered the last time he saw her, suitcase in hand, her voice steady as she said, "Without you, at least I can live as myself." Back then, he'd felt only anger. Now, he felt the hollow echo of loss. That night, David went home alone. The house was vast, silent, and unbearably cold. He opened a bottle of whiskey and sat in the dark. On the wall still hung their wedding photo, 2 young faces smiling under the Seattle Sunday. He stared at it for a long time, then reached up and took it down. The sound was sharp when the glass shattered on the floor like a bell ringing him awake. Patricia appeared in the doorway, silent for a moment before speaking. "You always thought she was your burden," she said softly. "But she was the last piece of humanity that kept you balanced. And now that she's gone, you see you have nothing left." David sat still, shoulders heavy. Outside, the rain poured harder, a relentless rhythm against the windows. He lowered his head and whispered, almost to himself, "I thought I had everything. But without Ruby, it was all just an illusion." The house in San Francisco was unbearably quiet. David sat on the living room floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes that the new housekeeper was organizing for the move. He was selling the house, once a symbol of success, power, love. Now it was nothing more than hollow walls echoing with voices long gone. When he opened the wardrobe in the bedroom, he found a small blue box sealed with tape. On the lid, written in familiar handwriting, "Ruby's things, don't touch." His heart pounded. Hands trembling, he tore off the tape and lifted the lid. Inside were a few photographs, a silver ring, and a thin leather notebook, old, coffee-stained at the corner. He opened it. The first line hit him like a punch. "If you're reading this one day, it's probably because I no longer have the strength to say it aloud." David froze. He turned the page, the slanted, gentle handwriting pulling him in. "You said I'm too sensitive. But really, I was trying to hear the things you never said. You told me not to embarrass you, so I learned to make myself smaller. You told me not to waste time on silly dreams, so I stopped dreaming. And one day I realized I was disappearing. Not because you killed me, but because I let you." David closed the notebook momentarily, but his hands wouldn't let go. His throat tightened. He opened it again. "I used to think love meant endurance, meant sacrifice. But now I know if you have to lose yourself to be loved, that love is just a golden cage. If I could return, I wouldn't ask you to love me again. I'd ask myself, please, don't forget who you are." Tears fell onto the paper. He hadn't cried in years, not when the company crumbled, not when the press attacked, not when friends walked away. But now, just a few sentences from her undid him completely. He sat there until the light outside turned amber. Then he closed the notebook, resting his palm on the worn cover. "Ruby," he whispered, voice raw, "I'm sorry." A week later, David drove to Portland. He didn't play music or make calls, only listened to the wind howling through the cracks of the window. By the time he arrived, a soft drizzle blurred the streets. He found the address from the article. Second Sunrise Boutique. The shop stood quietly at the corner, with its yellow-painted walls, brown wooden trim, and a glass door gleaming in the rain. Through the window, he saw women chatting and laughing, the hum of sewing machines steady like a heartbeat. And in the middle of it all stood Ruby, hair tied low, wearing an ivory dress, peace shining from her eyes. David watched from the doorway for a long time. She was not the Ruby he once knew. This woman stood with the grace of someone who had survived through fire. He finally pushed open the door. The bell above chimed softly. Ruby looked up, paused only for a second. "David." Her voice didn't tremble, didn't harden. It was simply the sound of a distant memory. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "I found your journal." Ruby nodded. So you finally did." He swallowed. "I didn't realize how much you endured." "I know," she said, "because back then, you never looked." Silence filled the room. The women quietly slipped outside, leaving the two alone where past and present met. "I didn't come to ask you back," David said softly. "I just came to say, I'm sorry." Ruby stood still for a moment before answering, "Thank you." He looked up, surprised. "You're not angry?" "No," she said gently. "Anger keeps you tethered. I don't want to be tied to the past anymore." David's lips quivered. "Are you truly okay?" Ruby smiled, a calm, luminous smile he had never seen before. "I am. And for the first time, you don't have to worry about that." She turned, picked up a small box from the counter, and handed it to him. "I was going to send this, but I thought you wouldn't understand until you were ready." Inside lay a silver ring, the same one she had once sold to pay for his tuition, now polished and gleaming. "You kept it?" he asked. "No," Ruby said. "I repurchased it. The shop in Seattle still remembered me." "You're giving it to me?" She shook her head. "I'm returning the only debt between us so we can both walk away light." David stared at the ring, his fingers tightening. "I don't deserve it." "I know," Ruby said softly. "But if I keep it, I don't deserve peace either." She placed the ring on the table, meeting his eyes clear and steady as water. "You were once my whole world, David. But I finally realized my world is so much bigger than you. I hope you find the good man you used to be." David gave a small, broken smile. "I wish I could go back." "No need," Ruby replied. "Without what happened, I wouldn't be who I am now." He nodded. There was nothing left to say. When he turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing through the glass one last time. Ruby was leaning over, speaking gently to a young woman beside her, hand resting on the girl's shoulder, her smile warm as sunlight. In that moment, David understood she hadn't just come back to life. She was helping others do the same, and he knew. His apology had come too late, but at least it had come from the truth. Driving out of Portland, rain brushed the windshield, the city lights stretching like liquid gold. On the passenger seat, the silver ring lay in its box, glinting faintly, steady as a heartbeat. For the first time in years, David turned on the radio. A voice sang softly, "You can't love someone if you never learn to love yourself." David smiled through tears. Far ahead, the sky was breaking open, and somewhere beneath the same dawn, Ruby Tyson was surely looking up at it too. 3 years later, spring in San Francisco was radiant, the sky clear, the sea breeze carrying its soft, salty scent. The city that had once been Ruby's downfall was now the stage of her return, not as someone's wife, but as Ruby Tyson, founder of the Phoenix Rising Foundation, an organization helping women rebuild their lives after divorce and emotional abuse. The foundation's first gala was held at a grand hotel in Nob Hill. Golden light spilled across the chandeliers, portraits lined the walls, faces of women, The foundation had helped. Each photo carried a story, a scar, and a smile that spoke of rebirth. Ruby entered wearing a simple, elegant ivory gown of her own design. The lights caught her skin, wrapping her in a soft golden glow. As she walked through the room, the women rose and applauded. They weren't cheering for success, they were honoring the reflection of something they'd all once lost, the belief that they were worthy of happiness. The event began with a short documentary tracing Phoenix Rising's journey. From a tiny sewing shop in Portland, Ruby had used her hands to mend fabric and the broken faith of dozens of women. Her voice played over the footage. "I used to think I needed someone to save me. Now I know I was the only one who could." When the video ended, the hall fell silent. Ruby stepped onto the stage, took the microphone, and smiled. 3 years ago, I walked away from the house I once thought was my haven. I had nothing, just fear, and an old sewing machine. But in my darkest days, I learned that I could start again if I still had my hands and a little faith. Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze was steady. "Tonight, I want to thank every woman in this room because you didn't give up on yourselves. You don't need anyone to hand you a crown. The moment you know your worth, you're already queens." The room erupted. Applause thundered like waves. Tears shimmered in many eyes. As Ruby stepped down from the stage, the applause still followed her. She greeted familiar faces, shook hands, exchanged smiles until she stopped. David was there. He stood at the back of the room, dressed in a black suit. Gone was the arrogance of his old self. His eyes were quieter now, tired, softened. Ruby looked at him calmly as though meeting a memory that no longer hurt. He approached, stopping a few feet away. The noise around them faded. "I've read every article about you," he said, "and I don't know what else to say, except, I'm sorry." Again, Ruby smiled gently. "You already said that." "Yes," he replied, trembling, "but this time, I want to say it in front of everyone." Before she could respond, he turned and walked to the stage. The hall grew silent once more. David took the microphone, his voice unsteady but clear. 3 years ago, I lost the best woman who ever came into my life. I hurt her. I belittled her. I made her believe her worth depended on me. But the truth is, I was the one who needed her, to learn how to be human. I only want to say one thing tonight. Ruby, I'm sorry." He bowed, then dropped to one knee. The room fell completely still. Ruby stood under the lights, her face serene, her eyes dry. She stepped forward and gently helped him to his feet. "You don't need to kneel to me, David," she said softly. "I don't live to be apologized to. I live so I'll never need an apology again." Her words rippled through the hall, landing deep in the hearts of everyone listening. Then she turned back to the crowd and smiled. "We've all fallen before, but what matters is we rise, and we keep walking." Applause burst forth loud. Unrestrained. Alive. David bowed his head, tears streaming down, and left the stage quietly. Ruby stayed in the light, no bitterness, no longing, only peace. Later that night, after the gala, Ruby stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the bay. The air carried the scent of salt, and moonlight shimmered on the water's surface. Maxine came beside her, smiling. "How does it feel, my queen?" Ruby laughed softly. "I'm just an ordinary woman, Maxine." "No," Maxine said, her eyes glinting. "You're the last queen who learned how to crown herself." Ruby said nothing. She looked up at the moon, calm, luminous, whole. She no longer needed love to prove her worth. She no longer needed recognition to feel enough. Because she finally understood, a woman's strength isn't measured by how she's loved, but by how she learns to love herself again after breaking. That night, on the hotel rooftop, the wind brushed against her dress, the fabric fluttering softly in the glow of the city. Ruby Tyson smiled the smile of someone who had walked through darkness and found her own light. And the story closed with a whisper meant for every listener still somewhere along their journey. If you ever feel small, remember, as long as you dare to love yourself, you are already the queen of your life.